Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. And in this video, this is something I've been wanting to do for quite a while. One of the bigger video game ranking videos that I wanted to cross off the list. And here I'm finally getting around to talking about my top 25 games of the 8th generation. Now in the past, I have talked about, my game of the year for certain years, or ranking every game from a specific year. However, this will be a ranking on a larger scale than that. I will be talking about my top 25 games that come out within the PS4, Xbox One generation, which includes games that came out between November of 2013 and November of 2020, which is obviously 7 years worth of games, quite a bit to be putting on a list like this. But again, let's do it. Now, coming into it, I will say that I did have a few ground rules. The first of which obviously being that the games listed here must have come out after the initial release of the 8th generation consoles, but before the release of the 9th generation consoles. And also must be games that originally came out on 8th generation consoles or PC. So what that essentially means is that if it was a game originally released for the previous generation and then was released on the 8th generation afterwards, those games will not count. And to go along with that, no remasters will be included on this list. However, remakes will be allowed. If a game was completely remade from the ground up for this generation, that game will be included. However, basic remasters will not. Also, this list will not be including any games from the Nintendo Switch or really the Wii U, as one, I personally haven't played a lot of them, but also because for me the Switch is kind of outside of the current video game generations, coming out in the middle of the 8th generation. And with Nintendo kind of being segregated from the rest of the video game market and kind of doing their own thing, I just thought it was better to leave them off this list. And the final rule before we get onto the honorable mentions is the fact that I will only be including one game per franchise. Now this is mostly so that I can have a more diverse list of games here, as, to be honest, there would have been a couple franchises that would have had multiple entries on my top 25. So because of that, I do feel like this rule did its part. But with that said, let's talk about the honorable mentions, which I do have quite a few of. The first honorable mention I want to be talking about is what I would probably consider the best game from the year of 2014. And spoiler, that means no games from the year 2014 ended up making the final list itself. But that would be Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, which is a really fun game. A game that does feel like a solid mix of like Batman Arkham and Assassin's Creed, while also having the Nemesis system, which is just pretty fun to play around with. However, I did find some of the mission design to be kind of underwhelming, and because I didn't include it in my list. There are also a few games from pretty established franchises that I did enjoy, and again, were close to making the list, but did not quite make the cut. One of those was Batman Arkham Knight, which is, to be honest, probably my favorite Arkham game, if not definitely in debate with City. And I do really like the game. However, it is another one that I was just kind of annoyed with the mission structure at points. And to be honest, the Arkham series as a whole has never fully clicked with me. Again, I do really enjoy all the games, but aren't really games that I adore by any means. So because that Arkham Knight didn't quite make it, also considered Rise of the Tomb Raider. I personally love Tomb Raider 2013, and Rise of the Tomb Raider is more of the same, and if not better in certain aspects. However, again, I just feel like there are better games from the 8th generation, and also other games that are more personal to me, to where Rise of the Tomb Raider didn't quite make the cut. And the same thing also goes for Devil May Cry 5, which is a game that I really enjoyed, probably more so than any other Devil May Cry game. And again, it is a very strong game, but to me, I just like other games more, and it just ends up being an honorable mention here. Next up, we have a few games that are a bit more personal to me, that are games that I do enjoy, but I wasn't able to quite fit them on the list. One of those is the other game from 2014 that I'm going to mention, and that is Watch Dogs, which I really wanted to put on the list. I know people look at Watch Dogs as a disappointment. I've always personally liked the original Watch Dogs. I've always liked the character of Aiden Pierce. I always liked the hacking abilities in this GTA-esque game. But again, I just feel like there are other higher quality overall experiences to me that I didn't quite get it onto the list. Another game that is very personal to me that I am very shocked did not make my top 25 is Firewatch, which was one of the first games I played on my PS4. It was one of the first games that I bothered experiencing from this generation. And it was a game that I really enjoyed my first experience with it. However, every time that I play it afterwards, I just find it more and more boring, especially because I've always been underwhelmed with how the story played out, to where to me, it doesn't quite have the lasting appeal as the other games that make the list. And while I do have some sort of connection to it, I just didn't feel like it was worth bumping off any of these other games that I personally enjoy more. Also considered putting on Inside, which is probably one of the better puzzle platformers I've played of the generation, but is another one that has some sections here and there that did annoy me quite a bit on my replay of it, that did harm my opinion enough for it to not quite make the list. I also considered Gravity Rush 2, which is a game that I was very, very high on after my initial playthrough of it a few years ago, to the point where I think this would have easily been top probably 15 if I did it at the time. However, I also tried replaying this recently and I just really couldn't get back into it, which is a shame because I do think it has a very interesting combat system where you can control gravity and fly all over the combat area. But I always found the combat itself to be a bit hit or miss, with the lock-on system in particular being kind of frustrating. And narratively, I do really like Gravity Rush 2, but for me, the annoying mission design and annoying combat kind of left it off the list here. Now, the final two games that I'll be mentioning as honorable mentions here are both games I played very recently and are both games that I very much considered putting on the list. I mean, there are two other games I did play recently that did end up making the list, but with these two, I had to leave them off, but I did feel like they were both really strong and I really wanted to talk about them. The first of which being Titanfall 2, which I do think is probably the best first-person shooter I've played of the generation. And while it's been years since I've cared about a non-story based first-person shooter, Titanfall 2 is really incredible. I mean, especially the campaign. I mean, I'm mostly talking about the campaign here. I really adored how this game was designed. I love the level design throughout. The action is really fast-paced and just overall fun, but also has some pretty interesting puzzle platforming along the way. It really is near perfection for the genre that it is trying to be. The problem is that the genre of a first-person shooter is something that I'm personally not that into nowadays. But even despite that, again, it bordered on the list. It was almost on it, but again, I had to cut it at the end of the day. And the same thing goes for the next game, which is Celeste, which to me is the best platformer I've played of the generation, which I really, really adored it. I was surprised, as again, Celeste is not my type of game. Again, a 2D platformer that is pretty difficult. Again, not the type of thing that I play nowadays. And when I was a kid, this is the norm for me, but nowadays I'm more so into these grander story-based experiences, and Celeste isn't that, but for what it is pretty great. Again, a really fantastic platformer, really great level design, and also tackles some pretty interesting themes along the way. And again, for a platformer like this to attempt to tell a story, I think is also a commendable feat. So for me, I mean, I thought Celeste was another really great game that I really wanted to put on the list, but it just barely missed out. But there we go. I mean, those are the honorable mentions. Let's get on to the list itself. We got 25 games here, my top 25 games of the 8th generation. And let's start off at number 25. This is a game that, I'll be honest, I really struggled with even putting on the list. Mainly because, again, there are so many good other options. And most of the list was pretty locked in, but this spot was very much up for grabs. And I do still debate over whether or not this was the right choice, but who cares? It's number 25 on the list, and here we do have Tales from the Borderlands, which, again, feels weird to have on a top games of the generation list, considering it is a very basic story-based adventure game. It's a Telltale game. It's really a game that didn't need to be released on 8th generation hardware. However, I still adore this game. And mind you, I came into this list wanting to have a representative of Telltale, whether it be in the honorable mentions or the main list itself. Out of my top tier of Telltale games, only one of those ended up qualifying for this list, which is why Tales of the Borderlands is kind of the representative for Telltale games here. And it would have been hard to debate between this and Wolf Among Us, which episode 1 of that was technically released before the 8th generation, which is why it's not on the list. But Tales from Borderlands is a great Telltale game. It is a great story-based adventure game telling a narrative on a scale that I don't think Telltale has attempted before. I mean, it really feels like a fun sci-fi action movie with a great cast of characters that keeps the entire ride pretty fun. I will say that the choices in this game are not as impactful as certain other Telltale games, but for me, this is certainly the most fun of the batch. Now, again, it was a struggle on whether it was worth putting it on the list, considering it is a Telltale game. But again, it is a game that is very personal to me. I have personally played this game too many times to count. And with how big of a fan I was of Telltale games, at a certain point within this generation, I felt like having one representative of their games was a necessity for the list here. So I decided to give Tales of Borderlands the bottom spot of the list here at number 25. Now, number 24 is one of those games I mentioned of games I just recently played in the preparation for this video. This is a game that I had wanted to play when it originally came out on PC a couple years ago. However, it was ported to other consoles more recently, and I finally got around to playing it, and that is Disco Elysium. And I really enjoyed my time with Disco Elysium. I mean, it is a very different game from what you would see nowadays. Again, it is a isometric RPG, though one that doesn't focus around combat and more so focuses around dialogue. And with a game like this, to make this game work, you really need a great batch of characters and obviously fun dialogue, and I do feel like this game matches that. You spend the entire game walking around this city trying to investigate a murder, and while whether or not the story is satisfying by the end is questionable in my eyes, I did really enjoy the road there and really enjoyed the sense of humor that this game has. I like the numerous amount of ways that you can navigate through the game, where everyone's playthrough could be pretty different based on how you decide to approach certain scenarios. I personally really love Disco Elysium, and I very much want to do a video on it at some point down the road, and for me it was good enough to land it here at number 24. Now, number 23 is a game that I did also struggle with putting on the list. This was another one that was an honorable mention for quite a while, and it wasn't until the last second that I decided to add it to the list, because it is a game that I have a lot of respect for, but it's a game that I struggle with deciding on whether or not I actually enjoy playing it. And that game is Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Again, I have so much respect for this game, this being a linear, story-based experience, a story that tackles the themes of mental illness in a way that we rarely see in the video game medium, all while also having a solid combat system and some really interesting puzzles along the way. It is a dark and creepy experience the entire way through, and it is something that I do have a lot of respect for, but it is mostly respect. Again, I don't actually enjoy playing this game. This is a game that I very much find it hard for me to revisit down the road, as it's just simply not a fun experience. And that is what I struggled with, because I look at this game in the same way that I look at many art house films, where, again, I have appreciation for what they're going for and what the meaning behind the game is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is something that I personally enjoy. However, with Hellblade here, I do feel like my level of respect for it is higher than any of the games we've talked about on this list so far. So while I might not consider it fun, I do think it is a well-made game. It is a really impactful game. And because of that, for me, it does land here number 23. Now, number 22, another game, really the only other game here that I have just recently played. And it's a game that I have played in the past and did not particularly care for. However, at the last second before making this video, I decided to try it one more time, and it just clicked with me this time. And that game is Control. And straight up, Control is a game that I originally played on my base PS4. And it is a game that did not run particularly well on my base PS4. And that led to a lot of frustrations where during combat sections, I would just die because the frame rate would drop at points to where I wasn't able to avoid enemy attacks or wasn't able to see an enemy coming. And that was a very frustrating experience. And I talked about that in my 2019 Year in Gaming video. However, recently I have been able to acquire a PS5, and through that was able to play it on PS5, and playing it on much better hardware to where the game doesn't have constant frame rate drops makes it a lot more of an enjoyable experience. I feel like in general I just had a much easier time with the game on my second attempt here, and overall have a high level of respect for this game as well. I mean, narratively, it's not like a top tier narrative for me from this generation, but it is a very solid one, especially for a more linear experience like this. I mean, the game is structured similarly to a Metroidvania game where you go to largely the same areas over and over again, where the game's not super long, but is able to tell a pretty focused narrative throughout its relatively short runtime. Again, in terms of 8th generation standards, where games have become more bloated as time has gone on. I did really like the protagonist in Jesse Faden, who's very well acted. And again, playing this on PS5, the game looks incredible. And really, in general, the art direction of this game is ridiculously strong. I mean, there's so many environments in this game that left me in awe at how really cool looking they were. But also, this game has some pretty cool visual effects at points that I feel like we rarely see in gaming. We get a lot of inner monologues from the main protagonist that really shapes the tone of this game. That is something that, again, I do greatly respect. I would definitely like to do a video on Control sometime down the road. But again, for now, it is here at number 22 on the list. Now, number 21 is a game that I just think is straight up fun. I mean, this is probably one of the most fun games on the list here. And again, due to my one game per franchise rule, the game on the list here is Hitman 2. Now, again, Hitman 1 and Hitman 2, there's not that major of a difference. I do think Hitman 2 is bigger and probably for the most part better, but I do think Hitman 1 has some pretty good maps as well. But again, really fun experience playing Hitman 2, where again, the game literally just puts you in a sandbox, tells you to kill some targets, and just lets you do whatever you want. You can approach these assassinations in a multitude of ways, and playing the game over and over again in order to find out all the different opportunities in these special kills, or even having a more standard approach to it. Like, it is pretty fun. I do like the replayability of this game. I do like the tension that you have where something could go wrong, or like once you get detected and you have to blend back in and whether or not that's going to be successful. I mean, there's so much fun to be had for me with the Hitman series. Again, Hitman 3 technically doesn't qualify here. And I do feel like Hitman 2 is overall a improvement from Hitman 1. The main reason it's not higher on the list though is because at this point, with what I currently look for in the gaming medium, I do want to have some level of narrative within my games. I do feel like Hitman kind of lacks that. I mean, yes, it attempts to tell a story, but kind of fails at it. But again, the gameplay is just so fun that I did have to have it on the list here at number 21. Now at number 20, we're moving on to another one of these games that I struggled with where to put it on the list, largely due to there is a discrepancy between how much I personally enjoy playing the game and how much respect I have for the game itself. But at number 20, we do have the remake of Resident Evil 2. Now, this is obviously the representative of Resident Evil on the list. I did also greatly consider Resident Evil 7, which I will say I probably personally enjoy as a game more than Resident Evil 2. However, I do feel like Resident Evil 2 is just a near perfect game in how it is designed. While it's a game that I didn't necessarily have fun while playing, I mean, to be fair, that's pretty much how I would talk about any survival horror game. It is a game that I think is one of the better representations of what a remake should be, where the gameplay was made more similar to that of a modernized version of like Resident Evil 4 with the over-the-shoulder view, while also still having the creepy tone and fun level design that came from the original game. Yeah, I really adore how this game is designed, where you spend a lot of the early game going from room to room, searching for items or keys that will allow you to enter other rooms. And this process to me was pretty fun, but also terrifying with the fact that Mr. X is following you around at points, and that is just terrifying, but also something that I do have a great level of respect for, in how terrified they were able to make me be of this fictional character. But again, like, it is the lack of enjoyment that I get from it that does have to land it as low on the list as it is. As every game beyond this, I do genuinely enjoy the process of playing those games. And while I will say that Resident Evil 2 Remake is probably a better game than a decent amount of the games that we're going to be talking about moving forward, I think there's an argument of it being the best made game of 2019, despite the fact that based on this list here, it is number 4. It is the lack of personal attachment to it that leaves it here at number 20. Now, number 19 is a game that was juggled around a bit on this list. There was a point where it was definitely lower. However, again, it was that argument that I just made there of Resident Evil 2 of these top 19 games are games that I personally just really enjoy playing that kept it here at number 19, and that is Ghost of Tsushima. And Ghost of Tsushima is a game that I did really enjoy when I first played it. It was a game that I was pretty hyped for. I mean, it's essentially the Japanese Assassin's Creed game that many people had been asking for. And in many ways, it does follow through with that. But I did come out of my first playthrough kind of being underwhelmed by its narrative, to where I decided to replay it immediately afterwards to reassess it. And during that playthrough, my opinion of its narrative significantly went up, but my opinion of the actual gameplay as a whole went down. And that's kind of where I left my opinions on it until pretty recently, where I did replay it on stream. And I will say that my opinions of it went back up a bit. I mean, I do think my issues that I had with my second playthrough are still there, in the sense that something I don't find interesting about this game is the side content. I think most of the side content is pretty boring. And to have a decent experience of the game and not get overly frustrated with its combat system, you do need to do side content to upgrade your weapon and get better armor. And while that isn't inherently a bad thing, I do think when a game all but forces you to do that, while also not really providing with interesting side content to do to begin with, to me that is a knock against the game, to where that's something I still don't like. However, I do love the open world. I do think it is a beautiful open world, one that I really did enjoy exploring once again in my replay. I do also love the story of Jin and the arc that he goes through over the course of the story, which is something I didn't respect the first time I played the game. But at this point, I'm pretty high on it. I do like the combat system as a whole. Again, like, I have frustrations with it from a difficulty standpoint if you don't get any upgrades, but for the most part, I do think it's handled pretty well. And I do like how the game really does take advantage of its setting in a way that even Assassin's Creed hasn't done. For me, Ghost of Tsushima is a very solid open world samurai game, and one that I overall do enjoy, which is why it's here at number 19. But I do think its lack of interesting side content do knock it down a little bit to where I can't put it much higher. Now, number 18 is a game that I thought at one point was going to be higher on the list. I mean, this is a game that started off around this spot, and then I replayed it on stream, and I absolutely adored my replay of it, to where I bumped it up quite a bit. However, in the process of finalizing the list, it got bumped back down, and here at number 18, I do have A Plague Tale: Innocence, and I adore this game. I really do. I do think this is the best linear story-based experience of the generation. But what is the hesitancy of putting it much higher is that it is a linear story-based experience, which isn't inherently bad, obviously, especially, again, coming into this generation where games have, again, gotten more and more bloated over time. I do think this was a nice change of pace to play A Plague Tale here that was more so structured similarly to games of the past. And again, it is a mostly linear game. It is a stealth game, which essentially makes it a puzzle game of you trying to navigate these areas without getting caught by enemies, and you having these numerous amount of tools that you can use in order to go through them. And you also have to escort your brother through a lot of the game, which can be annoying, but I do think this game handles it well for the most part. This game does have some really innovative level design at points with some great puzzles, and like overall, I really did adore this game, and it does all that again while telling a pretty solid story. While the story itself isn't anything mind-blowingly great, and it is mostly cliched and hits story beats that we've seen in the past, I do think the writing of the characters makes up for that, to where I do think the game really ends up being greater than the sum of its parts. And again, I really wanted to put it higher on the list. The main reason it's not is because I think when looking at the remaining games on the list, it's either games that I have more of a personal attachment to, or games that are on a much grander scale. And while that grander scale isn't always necessarily a good thing, I did feel like this definitely felt like an outlier moving forward on the list, and it just felt weird putting it higher. So despite how much I love this game, I did have to leave it behind here at number 18. Now number 17, we're moving on to a bit of a string of Japanese games all in a row here, each very much feeling like a Japanese game in their own rights. But at 17, we do have the best game, in my opinion, from the Yakuza series. We do have Yakuza Like a Dragon. Now, this was a tough debate because, again, there are so many Yakuza games, and there were a decent amount to fight for this spot here. I mean, you have Yakuza 0, which is looked at as one of the best in the series. I personally liked Kiwami 1 and 2, remakes of the first two games. I like Yakuza 6 more than most people, I feel like. I liked Judgment, which I considered part of the series here again, and wasn't going to split those up. But I did end up siding with Yakuza Like a Dragon, which is weird to pick considering it is very different from all those other games I just mentioned. Again, like the majority of the Yakuza games are beat-em-ups, but Yakuza Like a Dragon here turns the series into a turn-based RPG, and I do feel like it works really well. It really has one of my favorite RPG combat systems that I've played in a while. I mean, there's really only one other one that we'll be talking about much later in the list that is a decent comparison in my eyes. I do love the new cast of characters here, with Kasuga being a great new lead for the series moving forward. Again, it is a pretty massive game, probably the biggest Yakuza game up to this point, where it took me about 50 hours to complete. Which I will say that one of the reasons why this is the lowest game of these games that I do think are on a grander scale is because I did feel like this game was a bit bloated at a point. I do remember decent chunks of the mid portion of the game where it did feel like the game was kind of just meandering about without progressing the story that much, and I did feel like that did harm my opinion a bit. I did also feel like I needed to grind a bit more in this game than I really wanted to, but overall, I did really enjoy my experience with Yakuza Like a Dragon, and I do think it is a great addition to the Yakuza series, so for me it lands here at number 17. Now number 16, moving on to another newer entry in a Japanese series, another one that I have talked about in the past. And here at number 16, we do have Kingdom Hearts 3, which I did at one point name my Game of the Year 2019, which I still stand by that decision at the time. Now, it is technically changed on the list as, spoiler alert, the next game we'll be talking about is the top ranked game from 2019. And to be honest, I think there's even an argument for A Plague Tale being higher than Kingdom Hearts 3 for me at this point. But I still really enjoy Kingdom Hearts 3. Again, for me personally, I do think this is my favorite Kingdom Hearts game. Even though it demonstrates one of my biggest flaws within Kingdom Hearts and the fact that I don't really care about the Disney worlds. But despite that, the Disney worlds in this game are the best that they've ever been, in my opinion. And while Kingdom Hearts 1 is able to integrate its Disney worlds better into the main story, I do feel like the Disney worlds in this game are just more fun to play. In general, I did like the combat system in this game, which I know some people were let down by, but I personally found it really fun. But to be honest, if we were only rating the first 2/3 of the game, Kingdom Hearts 3 would probably barely be on the list, if even on the list at all. The main reason it's on the list is because of the last third of the game, which is such a great conclusion to the Xehanort saga, bringing the entire story of the series up to this point together in a way that was really satisfying to me, with it being filled with so many great moments throughout, but also really shows the massive flaw in the way that the game is structured, to where this game could have easily been structured a lot differently to make the entirety of the game feel a lot more satisfying along the way instead of leaving everything for the very end. But again, that last third of the game is so strong to me that I did still end up landing it here at number 16. Now number 15, we have a game that I have such a rocky relationship with, to where when I first played it, I adored it. I did think it was going to be my top game of 2019, but then as time went on, obviously Kingdom Hearts 3 ended up beating it. However, after making the video, I did start to regret it and then did put this game a bit higher. However, then I replayed it on stream not too long ago, where my opinion of it went back down because of how frustrated I got during certain gameplay sections of the game. But now, being a bit removed from that again, I once again have a higher opinion of this game. And at number 15, I do have Death Stranding. Again, for me, Death Stranding is a game that I really adored the first time around. Yes, there are so many annoying orders along the way that do harm my opinion of the game as a whole, but to me, it isn't enough to take out what this game does right in my eyes. Again, I love this game's narrative. I really love the lore of Death Stranding, and I do think this game handles its world building better than most other games within the gaming medium. Now, while a lot of people do complain about this just being a walking simulator, I personally do really enjoy the deliveries in this game. I mean, yes, again, some of them can be annoying based on certain terrain that you have to cross over or some dumb minor requirements, but for the most part, I really do like this element of you trying to pick out what you need for this order and choosing your loadout, crafting new materials, figuring out how to navigate around the world. Like, all those things are really interesting to me. And I do genuinely like this game, despite the fact that it does get frustrating at points. And it is those frustrations that make it so I can't really put it much higher. But again, I have so much respect for the narrative that is told here, for the world building here, the base gameplay loop that, again, isn't for everybody, but I do feel like it is for me, and that is the main reason I do have it here at number 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to a bit of a series of more story-based experiences here, with this one being a bit of an odd case for me, largely because it is the only one of these that I've only played once. I actually believe it is the last game on this entire list that I've only played one time. But that one experience with it was so strong that at number 14 here, I do have 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. I really adore the story of this game. I mean, at the end of the day, this game is a side-scrolling adventure game that has some RTS elements at points, but I feel like the way that this game handles its narrative is in a way that we've rarely seen, where, again, it tells its story in a completely non-linear way, giving you a massive timeline of all the events of the story that fills out as you experience another one of these events that, again, takes place at different points within the timeline. And again, like, the first experience of this game is just so riveting, where you're just really trying to figure out exactly what's going on here and how the timeline can work out in the way that it's being presented, and how does this world function, like all these things that were just so riveting to me. I mean, to me, this is one of the best sci-fi stories I've experienced in recent years, and one of the most compelling and unique ways I've seen a story being told in the gaming medium, to the point where I made 2 videos earlier this year just to talk about this game. I really did adore my experience with it. The reason it is as low as it is, though, is because something that I do struggle with it is that I can't imagine it being as riveting on the replay, as I do feel like this is a type of game that is great the first time you play it when you don't know what's going on. Is maybe good the second time to see if there's anything new that you pick up on, but outside of that, like, I can't imagine this experience sticking on multiple playthroughs, which is a knock for me, enough to land it here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to, again, another story-based experience here. And this one was tough for me because I do not think this game is good enough to be a number 13, if I'm being honest. But it is a game that I have a deep connection to, and I did spend a lot of time playing this game. I feel like I have to put it here. At number 13, I do have Detroit Become Human. Now, again, 13 feels high for me. I do think if this was like nearing the 20 range, it would feel a bit more appropriate, but 13's high. However, I did really adore this game when I first played it. Again, I have been a pretty big Quantic Dream fan in the past, where I do enjoy both Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls, despite their flaws. And Detroit Become Human is kind of a similar case. I actually think Detroit is the best of their games, despite the fact that it is also written by David Cage, and through that is very blatant with its themes and can have some wonky writing at points. But I will say, though, in terms of a modern adventure game, I did really like how many different outcomes were in this game, to the point where I 100% completed the game. I platinumed the game. I 100% every flowchart in the game. I played this game way too much. And again, I feel like I gotta recognize that and put it this high on the list, where, again, like, even though I do think from a pure writing standpoint and from a more general gaming standpoint, like, again, like, is 13 too high? In my opinion, yes, it is. But because of my own personal experience with it and how much I did end up playing it, I mean, for me, the personal connection ends up leaving it as high as it is here at number 13. Now, number 12, similar thing. I mean, I've played this game way too much. Another narrative-based experience. Really the last narrative-based adventure game on the list. The best one of the generation to me is Life is Strange. And I've talked about the Life is Strange series so much on this channel already. But again, like Detroit, I don't think Life is Strange is that good of a game. Like, I think the writing is actually pretty abhorrent at points, but it has a charm to it, and I always really connected to this game for whatever reason. Like, I acknowledge it's not good, but I've always really connected to the character of Max Caulfield. I really love the themes of nostalgia. I really love the time travel elements within the game. So despite me not thinking it's that good, it does have a lot of things that I personally connect to. And through that, again, I've played this game way too many times, to the point where this is one of my most played single games on my PS4. I've played this game for over 100 hours. That is how much I've played Life is Strange, a game that can be finished within like an 8-hour period. I mean, like, again, I've played this game way too much, and I acknowledge it's not that good, but I really just connect to it for whatever reason. So because I do have it the highest ranked of these narrative-based experiences, and it lands here at number 12. Now number 11. This was tough because 10 and 11 for me are very, very close. And while I do think this game is probably the better game, I do feel like I have more of a personal connection to the next one we'll be talking about. So at number 11, I do have Marvel's Spider-Man, the PS4 Spider-Man game that, again, I think is really fun. I do think out of any of the Spider-Man games I've played in the past, this is definitely the strongest of the bunch. I mean, yes, Spider-Man 2 that I played on the original GameCube was a lot of fun as well, but this really beats it by quite a bit. I mean, like, the fantasy of playing as Spider-Man is well realized here. Again, it's really fun to just traverse around the city. The side content is pretty generic, but I had a lot of fun doing it. Again, I have 100% completed and platinumed this game. Despite a lot of the open world activities are really just you doing the same things over and over and over again, but I felt compelled to do them. Narratively, I think this tells one of the better Spider-Man stories we've seen, and I think this version of Peter Parker is a pretty strong portrayal as well. The combat can get tedious, especially when you're playing on the hardest difficulty and when you've played the game for over 60 hours, but it still is a pretty fun system here, especially for a Spider-Man game. Overall, I just feel like it is a fun game, one of the better PS4 exclusives, and it lands here at number 11. At number 10, again, a game that is a lot more personal to me in the sense that I adored this franchise. This is a game that I was so hyped for, and I've put so many hours into. It is my most played game of the generation, and even to this day, I continuously replay this game every now and then and still do enjoy it, even though my overall opinion on it is definitely lower than what it was years ago. And that game is Assassin's Creed Origins. Now, again, this is the representative for Assassin's Creed on this list, and to be honest, there wasn't really any other competition. I mean, maybe Unity, I guess, but it's like, to me, considering like Black Flag is not in consideration considering it came out on last gen, Origins didn't really have much competition here. And again, Origins is a game that is very personal to me. I've played this game so much. I've played this game for 320 hours at this point. I've played the game well over 20 times at this point. Again, I've put so much time into this game, and I really do adore it. I really do adore the character of Bayek, who is probably one of my favorite protagonists, not just in Assassin's Creed, but in all of media. I really do like the initial game structure and how it handles its assassination missions, though the back portion of the game is a bit of a mess, and that is one of my bigger flaws with the game, is that the back like third of the game is just all over the place and really feels like they had no clue what they were doing, both narratively and gameplay wise. But again, as a Assassin's Creed Witcher clone, which are two things that should have never come together to begin with, but out of the Witcher-like Assassin's Creed games, this is the best of the bunch in my eyes. It's the one that respects the older games the most, I guess. Though again, not hard to beat after Odyssey. But I do genuinely enjoy this game, and while I probably would have enjoyed it more if it wasn't an Assassin's Creed game, for me it is the best Assassin's Creed game of the generation, and it lands here at number 10. Now at number 9, we're moving on to having to pick a game from a series that had two very strong entries this generation in my eyes, and that is the Final Fantasy series. And for me, this was a massive debate over the game that I think is genuinely the better game or the game that I have more of a connection to, where Final Fantasy VII Remake is the game that I would consider the better game from this generation. However, I do think Final Fantasy 15 is the one that I have a closer connection to, is a game that really just hit me in a way that very few games do. And while I did enjoy my replay of Final Fantasy 15 that I did recently and really got further into the lore of the series, I do feel like I have to side here with Final Fantasy VII Remake, which to me is definitely the most polished of the two. I mean, they're both really strong action RPGs. I mean, they both have similar flaws in the fact that I think they're both a bit bloated. Mind you, I think 15 is a bit less focused than 7 Remake is. And while I do feel like 7 Remake has lower lows than 15 in my eyes, 7 Remake is really an evolution of 15 from a gameplay standpoint, where I think they take the combat system of Final Fantasy 15 and like further improve upon it. We obviously have the retelling of the story of Final Fantasy 7 with all these really iconic characters from Cloud, the Tifa, the Aerith, and Barret. The way the story is retold as well also makes it feel like it's on a grander scale. And the way that this game handles it being a remake is really interesting to me, to where Part 2 is definitely one of my most anticipated games moving forward, as I really just want to see more and see what exactly they're going to do moving forward. Again, it was close between this and Final Fantasy 15, where Final Fantasy 15 is a game where I adore the character of Noctis and really personally connected to him a lot more than I do with like Cloud, but I do think 7 Remake is the better game and is the one that ends up landing here at number 9. Now, number 8 is a game that I really enjoyed when I first played it around the time that it came out. However, it took me until very recently to replay the game, and that is Nier Automata. And again, this is a game that like I remembered adoring when I first played it, but then time went on and like it started to slip further and further and further in my top games of all time list whenever I would revisit it. And after my latest replay, it really skyrocketed once again. I really do love Nier Automata, and it really is obviously a unique game. I mean, Nier games in general are typically unique in the way that they approach handling its themes, but Automata does it in a way that I think was completely unprecedented, both in its meta-ness, but also within the context of the game itself. Like other Nier games, it does require multiple playthroughs, and I do think this game in general handles itself a lot better than the previous games in the series. It also has a really fun combat system that mixes up hack and slash gameplay with shoot 'em up elements. It really tells a narrative that takes so many chances, and I do feel like for the most part, it hits on every opportunity. I did really enjoy my most recent replay of this game, and it jumped all the way up here to number 8. Now number 7, and at this point, I mean, this is the top of the top tier for me. I mean, to be honest, I think all 7 of the games that we're about to be talking about are borderline top 10 games of all time for me, not even just this generation. But at number 7 here is actually the only game from the year of 2016 to even make the list at all. And here we do have Uncharted 4, A Thief's End. And again, I adore the Uncharted series. It is one of my favorite series of all time. And there was a debate between this or Lost Legacy, but I think at the end of the day, I had to go with A Thief's End here, which I will say narratively feels like a departure from the previous entries in the series, but does also feel like a very strong epilogue to the original trilogy. I think it is a nice farewell to the character of Nathan Drake and gives him a fitting farewell in a way that we rarely see within the gaming medium, while also gameplay wise taking what the original Uncharted games did and improving upon it in almost every conceivable way. It is still a third-person shooter with a bevy of platforming sections, but through the addition of like new tools and vehicles, it really does change things up. The puzzles in this game are just as strong as ever. And again, narratively, it really does hit. Like, I think it really works. Like, again, it is a radically different tone from the previous 3 games, which are all more so focused on having a really fun adventure, while this game definitely takes itself a lot more seriously. And while, again, I've complained in the past about how certain parts of the game are slow in my eyes and the game is a bit more bloated than I personally would have liked it to be, it is still an incredible experience from beginning to end and a really satisfying end to one of gaming's most iconic characters. So because of that, I end up landing it here at number 7. At number 6 is a game that some might say is the best game of all time. I obviously really enjoy it with it being number 6 here, but it's not quite on that level for me. That game is Red Dead Redemption 2. And I really do adore a lot of what this game does. I do think narratively, Red Dead 2 here tells one of the grandest stories in all of gaming, especially a really grounded story. Again, I feel like within the gaming medium, obviously, a lot of the best stories out there have some sort of element of sci-fi or fantasy, while Red Dead 2 tells a very grounded story and does so in a really heartbreaking way, but also really satisfying way. I mean, the way that the characters of Arthur Morgan and John Marston are handled over the course of this game is really incredible, and some of the most emotional scenes in the history of gaming really come from this game for me. And the fact that it is a prequel to the original Red Dead Redemption and is able to connect to the first game without any contradictions and also tells its own story in such a satisfying way while also leading up to the events of the first game is insane. It is insane what they were able to accomplish from a narrative perspective. That being said, I do think gameplay wise, to me, there are certain things that do feel a bit clunky. I think the navigation around the world, the shooting in the game, like there definitely is some clunkiness there. I do think certain systems do get pretty tedious, but even then, for the most part, I do enjoy the gameplay as well. I do enjoy how realistic this open world is. And for that to be mixed in with the grand narrative that this game tells as well, it really is an all-time great game for me, and it lands here at number 6. Now number 5, and I will say the top 5 here were definitive. There was never really a chance that anything was going to crack this top 5. However, the order is very difficult for me to where all 5 of these games have an argument for being my favorite game of all time. And I think all 5 of these games could have been number 1 at any given point. And it is very difficult to truly assess which one I actually like more, because people have asked me in the past, what's my favorite game of all time? I don't have a solid answer, just because there's so many games that I hold in such high regard that I have at around the same level. And these 5 games are part of that batch of games. But again, I had to order them. I had to make an order here. So at number 5, we have actually a bit of a change since the last time I did a ranking involving some of these games. And here we do have The Last of Us Part 2. And again, spoiler, I did do a Sony exclusive ranking a while back, and The Last of Us Part 2 was ahead of 2 of the games we will be talking about. Actually, it was number 1 on the list. Since then, it has dropped a bit. However, I still love The Last of Us Part 2. Again, like I adore The Last of Us as a series. I mean, The Last of Us Part 1, if someone were to put a gun in my head at this point, it would be the game that I would say is my favorite game of all time. But The Last of Us Part 2 is very strong as well. I mean, again, so many risks were taken with this story in a way that pissed off a good chunk of the fan base. But again, I personally always found it to be pretty satisfying, and especially now having replayed the game multiple times, reanalyzed its narrative. I've done an almost hour-long retrospective, my longest retrospective up to this point. I do really have an appreciation for this game. And really, again, like it being below the next 4 games is not an indictment on this game. I think all 5 are 5 of the best games I've ever played. But in comparison to the other Sony exclusives that are here, I do think one other game I would consider a pretty perfect game. And the other one is a game that I probably have more attachment to over the course of this generation than I do with The Last of Us Part 2, where I do feel like a lot of what makes me feel so attached to The Last of Us Part 2 is that I am so attached to The Last of Us Part 1. And while Part 2 is still really great, and I do really love a lot of how this game is handled, I do love the scale of this game despite the fact that it is a mostly linear game. Again, I do truly love this game, but I do feel like in comparison to these next 4 that we'll be talking about, it does feel a little notch below those. So because of that, it has to land here number 5. Now number 4, and this was tough. Another game I hold in super high regard. I mean, if you asked me after a year of me having my PS4, what was my favorite game on the console? This would have been the answer. It's another game that I've put so much time into, well over 100 hours. Played this game numerous times, really adore it. At number 4, I do have to have Horizon Zero Dawn. And Horizon for me is a game that really checked off everything I wanted from it. Again, it being a Witcher style RPG, I think it executes most of what it's trying to do pretty well, while also not overly bloating itself. I mean, again, like one of my biggest issues with games this generation are how bloated games have been. However, I feel like Horizon is a game that, for the most part, is able to avoid the bloat. It is a much smaller open world than what you would expect from most other Witcher clones. It tells a pretty personal story of Aloy and her discovering her origins. It has a decent amount of sci-fi elements within it that really interested me. It has a pretty fun combat system. It has some really interesting mystery behind the narrative, both in terms of, like, again, what is going on within this world and how did it become like this, but also with certain characters that Aloy meets along the way. I mean, coming out of this generation, Horizon is the series that I am the most excited to see what they end up doing with moving forward. To me, Zero Dawn just really did everything I wanted it to do and really came out at the perfect time. Really, from when I originally got it till the release of Assassin's Creed Origins, like, again, I played this game over and over again. I do still really adore it. And it lands here at number 4. Now number 3, and here we do have the top Sony published exclusive. We do have God of War. And this was really brutal to me to put this at number 3, because there was a point where I was considering God of War as my favorite game of all time. And having it this low is tough. Again, like, I think, and I will stand by this, I think God of War might be the most perfect game ever made. I do think this game achieves everything that it sets out to do. Like, I legitimately can't think of a single true flaw with the game. I mean, maybe there are, like, things that maybe I would like to see expanded on in future games, but, like, nothing in this game came off as a disappointment to me. I adored this game's narrative. I do think, while it was definitely a different narrative from what I was expecting coming in from the previous God of War games, the way it handles the relationship between Kratos and Atreus, and also having this really interesting lore being set up along the way, while also connecting back to previous games. I thought that was done really, really well here. Gameplay-wise, it has a really strong combat system, changing it up from the combat of the old God of War games, but does it in a pretty satisfying way. It is also an open world game somehow, which most of the side content in this game is pretty enjoyable, with it really feeling like a big part of this journey that Kratos and Atreus are going on, and you have the banter between the two. Really, just the focus of this game, despite the fact that it is technically an open world game, is pretty insane. To me, God of War is really a perfect game. Like, I legitimately have no real faults with it. The only reason it's not higher is because the next two games are games that connected with me more so at the point that I played them than God of War, which again is not an indictment on God of War at all, but it is still below the next two we'll be talking about, so it is here at number 3. Now number 2, and again, another game I would have said is my favorite game of all time. I'm pretty sure I've said this earlier in the channel, that I would have said that this is my favorite game of all time. At number 2, I do have The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. And The Witcher 3 is a game that I think is one of the most innovative games of the generation. I do think this game obviously spawned a lot of Witcher clones moving forward, some of which we talked about in this video. But none of them really match what The Witcher 3 was able to do. Again, this open world RPG telling a really epic narrative in scale, while also having really quality side content along the way. I love the character of Geralt and seeing his interactions with this really strong cast of characters. And, like, again, it's weird too with The Witcher, because, like, I came into this having never played The Witcher 1 or 2. And with this game being the end of the series and the end of Geralt's story, I feel like it does a satisfying job at telling its own story. I mean, yes, there are certain characters that show up and you definitely do miss out on the context behind their relationships, but I never felt like any of that mattered. And to me, The Witcher 3 just really excels at really everything you would want an open world RPG to be. Again, having really interesting lore and a great set of characters, a great main campaign that can be a bit long. It definitely goes on for quite a while, but again, it does feel epic in scale. And also has some really heartwarming moments along the way, has some of the grandest battles of the generation. Like, it really is an extremely well-made game. Not perfect. I mean, there definitely are a handful of glitches in the game. It definitely does feel clunky to move around at points. But for what it's trying to be and for what I want it to be, The Witcher 3 does succeed in most aspects. And it does land here at number 2. And with that, let's get to number 1. The best game of the generation is a game that has always clicked with me. I mean, when I first played this game, it did take me by surprise at how much I really adored it. But then I replayed it and adored it even more. And since then, I've now watched like other people play it. I've played certain spin-offs of the game. And like, I just feel like this is the game that connected the most to me over the course of this generation. At number 1, we do have Persona 5. And specifically, we can talk about the Royal version here, which is weird considering the last time I talked about Persona 5 Royal, I do feel like I came off pretty negative on it in my Persona 5 retrospective. Though, I mean, full disclosure, that was recorded a while ago. And my opinions on the Royal version have, for the most part, changed. To where, again, like, I think number 1 on this list is essentially Persona 5 Royal. I do think it is the better version of the game. Again, Persona 5 is the best JRPG I've ever played in my entire life. I do think it is the most fun turn-based RPG I've ever played. I really love the combat system and how intricate it is. I love the set of characters that you interact with over the course of the game. I love the narrative as a whole, which very much feels like that of a shonen anime, with you having your crew and adding in new members as the story goes along. And the Royal version just expands upon it. I mean, yes, I still don't like that there are certain scenes that you are forced to see in the Royal version that do feel like fluff, but everything else is pretty much improved. It does add in characters that are also intriguing in their own right and do play a massive role in the expanded third semester that they added to the game. The combat system is improved, making it a bit more fast-paced and adding in more elements that shake things up there. You have the day and night cycle of you having to manage what you do every day in order to increase your stats, and that's also a really great element of the game. I really love how the real world and the metaverse elements of the game combine and boon each other pretty well. I do really like how the narrative keeps on ramping up after every arc to the point where the end game is really just insane, with it containing some of my favorite sequences in all of gaming. You also have, again, the third semester, which should have been terrible. Again, like any game that just like adds in extra superfluous content is typically pretty mediocre and ends up bloating the game. But here they're able to really match the quality of the ending of the original Persona 5 and somehow expand upon it in a really satisfying way. Not to mention how emotional this game gets by the end of it, where you feel so close to all of these characters, and to say farewell to them at the end of the game is really emotional. And I'll be honest, I did get really emotional when I finished my playthrough of Persona 5 Royal. Like, it really is a game that really hit me in a way that no other game this generation has. Despite the fact that the game is around 100 hours to complete, it never felt boring to me. It never felt overly bloated. Like, it really is a perfect representation of what I personally want from a video game. And for me, it does land here at number 1 as my top game of the 8th generation. So there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of the top 25 games of the 8th generation, which was kind of the big video game ranking video I wanted to do for the year. I mean, usually what I'm going to try to do at least is have my year in gaming videos where I'm able to rank every game that I've played from the previous year. But I also want to do another bigger ranking video at some point over the course of next year as well. So stay tuned for those. Again, the 2021 year in gaming video and whatever other big ranking I do. Now, some of these games that I talked about in this list are games that I did actually play pretty recently, and through that, we'll probably end up making some sort of video based around in the near future, or possibly far future as well, considering how many video game videos I want to do. But again, we'll see. So with that is the video. Those are our top games for the 8th generation. Thank you for watching.